Welcome to episode 60 of the Forward from 50 podcast, where we interview people over 50 who are pursuing new direction for their lives. It's an opportunity for men and women to tell their stories their way in their own words. I'm Greg Gerber, the founder of Forward from 50 and your host for today's show. Today I'm interviewing a 54-year-old man who is a very devoted father to his teenage daughter. However, that relationship was challenged, first by him contracting colorectal cancer, then by divorce. Yet through it all, his passion and purpose remains being the best dad he can be and encouraging other fathers to see extraordinary value in raising children. Paul Weigel was diagnosed with colorectal cancer when he was 43 years old after doctors discovered a fist-sized tumor in his colon. It was a frightening experience for him because his daughter Natalie was only 3 years old at the time. Not only did he want to watch her grow into the successful young woman he knew she'd become, Paul knew that growing up without a father could derail Natalie's life in ways she was too young to understand. Paul knew that colorectal cancer was the number one cause of death for men and the number two cause of death for women with cancer. In fact, 1 in 20 people will contend with colon cancer in their lifetimes. Even though he did not lead a healthy and active lifestyle, getting cancer was still a big wake-up call for Paul. Faced with the prospect of dying at a young age, the experience showed him how important fatherhood is not only to Paul, but to Natalie as well. To tell us more about his experience and how building appreciation for fatherhood and increasing awareness for colorectal cancer has become a driving purpose in his life, please welcome Iron Dad Paul Weigel to the show. Thanks for joining me today, Paul. I really appreciate the time. It's always nice to talk to a fellow Arizonan. So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you developed this passion in helping people get diagnosed for colorectal cancer.
Greg, thanks for having me here today. It is so cool to see the work you're doing about developing a passion and a purpose, because that is really what I am doing and what I'm doing as I'm rolling out a story about some of my experiences that happened about 10 years ago. I am now 54 years old. However, 11 years ago, when I was 43 years old, I got diagnosed with colorectal cancer. And my tumor, I know here our group is supposed to be people 50 or older. And so in theory, we're all supposed to have had our colonoscopies and had our discussions with our doctors, right? 10 years ago, 11 years ago, I had symptoms going for many years, had talked a little bit with my doctors, and they had ignored many of the issues, which then ended up that I had a tumor about the size of my fist. It was at the junction of my rectum and my colon, so just about 6 inches up from where you poop. It's easier to say poop the more we get older, and especially in my world. And I ended up then having to go through, as many cancer patients have to, had to go through a long regimen of having chemotherapy and radiation and surgery and recovery. And so that happened to me 10 years ago. And I had a 3-year-old daughter at the time. And so 10 years ago, when I was in my 40s, I just took all of that time and I put it in a little box and I put it up on a shelf, literally and figuratively, because I had written some and I just put it off on the side. But now that my daughter has become a teenager and started to ask questions and I got older, I started to re-look at what's going on with cancer and colon cancer especially. And I was blown away at that, even though it's 10 years, 11 years later, what I'm still seeing and what we are seeing is that colorectal cancer numbers are going up incrementally and exponentially every year. We don't really know the reasons for it yet, but what we are seeing now is that with men over 50, colon cancer is the number one leading cause of cancer deaths. And for women, it's the number two leading cause of cancer death behind breast cancer. And this thing that is so horrifying for me and where it's really become a passion is that colon cancer is the one that can be prevented. And that if people are just going and getting screened and talking with their doctors and having their colonoscopies or using Cologuard, that 90% of those cancers can be found before they become really malignant. They'll just be small polyps and people will live longer and happier lives. So I'll pause for a second. My daughter was 14 or 13, started asking me questions. And I started pulling together my notes and my story about what happened 10 and 11 years ago. And that ended up becoming this book called Iron Dad. And my book goes through and explains really what fatherhood meant to me and how important she was to be in my life. But just as much, it became an opportunity to share my story and with others so that they don't have to go through what I did. So it really has become my passion and my purpose.
That's great. Now, you were a single
Thank you.
parent when you were diagnosed with cancer. Is that what you said?
We were not officially single parent, but we were pretty much, but we were part time. We were splitting up our time, and so we did divide and conquer. But certainly throughout most of the treatment, I went through that individually, and then right after my treatment was done, we separated and divorced. Yes.
It must have been very hard. And one of the reasons that you developed this passion to push through, to have a young daughter and to be diagnosed with what could be a potentially fatal illness.
Yes, my daughter has always been my passion. That is, I hope that fellow parents have that same level of love and desire for their kid. When I was growing up, I didn't necessarily get as much of that from my parents growing as I was getting older, as many of us did in our generation. We didn't have our daughter until we were in our late 30s, actually turned 40. So I had this rough life, finally had my life come together with a daughter and a wife, and we were living up in Seattle area, a block away from the water, and it really felt like the world was everything I dreamed about. So then to have cancer, it was, oh my gosh, this is the first time in my life that I really have something to live for and to have passion about and to imagine a future and a dream and what life can be, then and to have this horrible fear that I might not make it. And my tumor was big and I was stage 3 and I had 7 of 21 lymph nodes affected. And so my numbers, we try not to look at numbers. Doctors tell us not to look at numbers, but it was a flip of a coin of whether I was going to make it 5 years,
Oh,
let alone 10. So yes, absolutely. To be able to see all those things in her life that I dreamed about throughout all my treatment has been a wonderful joy and excitement every single day.
that's great. And now you've been cancer free for almost 10 years?
Now 11.
Now
Yes.
11.
Yes.
Very
Yes. Yeah.
congratulations.
Thank you. As for cancer patients who are out there, sometimes you get your diagnosis and you get free and clear and you're told, okay, you have no evidence of disease, you're cured. And it took them a long time. It took them 9 years for them to finally decide that little shadows or spots weren't a cancer. So for 9 years, I was a cancer patient. But yes, I am incredibly, if you're religious, I'm blessed. If you're not, I'm incredibly lucky.
That's a good way to put that. Is there a
Yes.
possibility that the cancer can come back?
Given colon cancer, no, they don't think so. That the way colon cancer works. That's interesting for you to say the way colon cancer works, like it's a business. Colon cancer, most of the time, if it's contained, and the tumor is contained and it is not metastasized, which means that it's spread to different parts of your body, if they have been able to contain it, your likelihood of survival increases a huge amount. And once I got to that point where they've determined that all these different things that they were monitoring or that would pop up were not cancerous related, that yes, they finally said, I'm now cancer free with no evidence of disease, and they would not expect this cancer to come back.
That's awesome.
However, it is, yes. I like to think that I've got half of my life ahead of me, but that's also one of my passions now is one of the many things that I went through 10 years ago was thinking about the fact that I had conversations with my doctor and I had some things going on with my body and I was afraid to have those rough conversations with the doctor. And I know we go into our doctor's appointment visit and those visits, the doctor comes in and out and they've 3 or 4 minutes to address everything. And in many cases, they just rushed by what could be a really big issue. And in our generation, I think people are still a little afraid to say, okay, doctor, hold on. I want to talk about this more because what you're saying doesn't quite sound right, or it doesn't feel right, or this is bigger. I mentioned at the start of our interview, I had symptoms going with my tumor for at least 5 years. And early on when I was, but way before I was diagnosed, all of a sudden my GI system started changing, and that pizza used to be my favorite food. And then all of a sudden I couldn't eat dairy at all, that I had horrible IBS. And it was just, and I thought it was issues to either what I was eating or some of what I was eating. I was partying a lot. And then shortly thereafter, about a year or two after, I started having blood in my stool sometimes. Now, when I talked with my doctor, I said, I've got GI issues and I've got blood in my stool. He said, that's probably because you were in your 30s and early 40s and you're eating like shit. But then, was true, too many jalapeno potato, but just as much too, I was a triathlete and I was riding a bike a lot, and he assumed that I had hemorrhoids. So rather than put the two things together and say GI issues, blood, that's probably something big to consider. Instead, he was like, GI issues, take Tums, blood, take preparation H, move on. And that it was only when I got actually almost critically ill that we finally had those rough conversations.
I've talked to a number of people over the last year or so who have gone through similar experiences where they've been misdiagnosed or not even diagnosed with the problem. And they all said afterwards, you've got to take ownership of your own health care. And if you think something,
Yes.
stand on the desk and shout until they listen to you and take a test or whatever it is they have to do to get looked at.
Well, yes. And if your one doctor doesn't listen to you, talk to another one.
Exactly.
Yeah. One of the things after I had my tumor removed, it was really interesting. One of the side effects I had that I didn't realize until after was I had dreams about going to the bathroom in my sleep. And it was because I had a light sensation right underneath my belly button, deep down in my gut, that was where the tumor was growing. And so actually all the time, the moment the tumor was removed, that sensation was gone. But it was a teeny little amount of pressure that in the middle of the night felt like I needed to go to the bathroom. But if I had listed out all of these things that were going on rather than just onesie twosieing them, I wouldn't have been in that position. And yes, we're hesitant to what you said. You've talked to lots of different people and we've been hesitant to be advocates for ourselves.
Exactly. Advocates, that's a good word to put it. Yes. You had mentioned that you ate poorly, and I guess that is something that I have done as well for much
Sure.
of my life. And what kind of diet changes have you had to make as a result of going through this experience?
That is a great question. My diet changes have been significant, but they haven't been nearly as much as my ex-wife would have wanted me to have. Some of the things, there's just general things we know that we read and we learn about that. Of course, we're supposed to have less red meat. Of course, we need to have more salad and more fiber in our systems. For me, one of the biggest things has been really listening. It has been, well, it's been twofold. At the start, it was listening to my body of what I could eat versus not. I mentioned that all of a sudden I no longer could eat dairy, and that's still the case. That if I have a piece of pizza, it is not going to be good for anybody. And my daughter, if we're out and she'll be eating some pizza, and I'll say, "Can I have a bite?" She'll be like, "No," because what's going to happen? And I'll still push it. And then she'll be like, do you have Imodium with you? And I'll be like, okay. The other one has been processed meats, that I've really tried to avoid eating processed meats because they're just not healthy for us. And then the chips and those different things are pretty much no longer part of my diet. But some of the weird things too, for me, one of the weird things is because during my surgery and we had my colon, we had about 14 inches of my colon removed. And with that, I can't have as many fibery foods in volume.
Okay.
So if I have a big salad or if I have broccoli, it is not, it is serious rumbles in my tummy. And so all those have just been lessons learned as I've gone. And then the funny one is I've had to change my beer drinking because the beers that are really heavy just are not super good for my system anymore. So it really has been a combination of what do the guidelines say we should be eating versus not, and just as much, what does my body tell me that I can work with? And I'll jokingly say, but I've said this with other friends, since I switched off of beer, I've switched over to vodka because vodka is clear and it has no real side effects or sulfides or any of those things.
Okay. Very good.
So,
What do you do for a living, or did you do for a living at that time?
so at the time, along the lines of passion and purpose, and I said that passion has been my daughter. When I was originally diagnosed in my 40s, I was running communication groups for many different organizations. I had been leading internal communications for Washington Mutual Bank. I had worked at Microsoft. I had done some key strategy work with REI and Boeing. I was very much on a strong career track. I ran communications for the holding company that ran Redbox and Coinstar. But once I got diagnosed, I really made a big career shift and I moved more into a consulting world. But that consulting world gave me the opportunity to watch my kid grow up.
Exactly.
And exactly. And so my job was I worked enough that allowed me to see her. And mentioned being a single dad and a part-time dad, that I was the one who I always walked her to the door at school. I always picked her up from the door at school, even when she didn't want me to. I was the dad that went on every field trip up until seventh grade. And it almost always seemed to be all the other moms and Paul. And so that had been my career. Where you talked about passion and purpose, as I started writing my story about a year ago, I knew that was what was that my daughter is now 14. And so by her being 14, she is still my passion and purpose, but she wants nothing to do with because she's 14 and I still get those opportunities where I can. But I decided to take some time off to work on my story and really become an advocate because this is so important. It is so important for people to be aware of what's going on, be taking care of their health and doing the right things. So I have been having great conversations with people like you, and I have been in lots of different meetings regarding colon cancer. I've recently become part of the advisory board for LIB, which is it is no longer, yes, Lance Armstrong is no longer involved with it. He hasn't been for about 15 years, but Livestrong is live and running. And actually, they are celebrating their 20-year anniversary of Yellow Band. And I actually put on, in terms of passion, I had put on my yellow Livestrong band 15 years ago when a friend of mine we thought was getting diagnosed with cancer as it was all the rage. And I just decided it was important to me to keep on way before I had cancer. And the only times I have taken off my Livestrong band has been for surgeries because they have said I've had to take it off because they don't want to have a band on in case something is going critically wrong during surgery that it's underway.
Right.
So really my life has become a combination of watching Natalie, helping people get aware of what's going on, and trying to be inspirational. What along those lines, I mentioned, I think earlier on, I was a triathlete and I've ridden bikes for a long time. I realized there's power in my story now as a 54-year-old 10-year cancer survivor triathlete to be sharing what I'm doing. And it's not just cancer patients and cancer survivors don't just, I hate the word survive because survive almost means passive. You mean you're like, I got through it, I struggled, but you know what? We are warriors and we are fighters and we do all every day. So many of us do amazing and crazy things. And I do crazy things 6 months after finishing my chemotherapy, I did an Ironman triathlon, in part because honestly, you asked about whether I was cancer free or not earlier. I didn't think I was going to make it 5 years. And I didn't know if my daughter would remember, but I wanted to have a memory for her that I hope she would have of me crossing the finish line and her to know that daddy wasn't a quitter. And that was 10 years ago. And now moving forward again, I've recaught the triathlon bug. And so
So
I am as
both of you are
go
doing
ahead.
triathlons?
Oh, she's not quite ready to do a
Yeah.
triathlon.
But do you
That would
think
be a dream. We trained some. We live in Arizona, as we mentioned, and I was able to purchase a very cheap and so as I'm running through the neighborhood, she will be on the golf cart driving next to me with the water or doing some of those things just to make sure I'm okay.
that
That's how we're training together. Yes.
okay?
But I'm trying to be inspirational. I later on this month I'm doing a half Ironman, and then in October I'm doing a full Ironman. In part because people look and say, "Dang, not only did this guy beat cancer, but he's thriving." That I hope that's a great message that people can take for their own battles with cancer too.
I agree. How'd you get involved in Ironman competitions? There's a little bit of crazy involved in that, to be honest.
Yes, no, that is absolutely true. There is a lot of crazy to be involved with that. In my case, even more, I'd mentioned early on in my life that I was working way too hard, and I lived in downtown Seattle, and so worked a lot, stayed up until midnight, 1 o'clock, a whole bunch, but I was miserable. And there was one day I was in my early 30s. This is even before triathlons, but I was 225 pounds. I was a big guy. I wasn't exercising. And a buddy of mine and I were having breakfast one morning, very much recovering from the night before. And we saw a group of runners come in who had just finished a 5K. And as they came in, they were jovial and they were happy and they were looking like they were living their best lives. And here we were not. And we made a $5 bet. We made a $5 bet for who could win a 5K in 2 months.
Win.
And
Participate, just win it?
no, well, win between the two of
Okay.
us, right? I mean, because we're going to be in the back of the pack, but and for me, all of a sudden, and the first time I went out to run, I I put on my shoes, I started running, I thought I was doing great, and then all of a sudden I felt my heart exploding, and I looked down at my watch and I had only run 1 minute and 12 seconds. And I knew it had this huge incremental aspect to go. But once I finished that first 5K, actually, as I finished the first 5K and I crossed the line, and I was so proud, it was probably one of my most amazing moments at that point. A trainer hands me the sheet of paper and she says, "You can do better." I'm like, "You're ruining my moment here." And so I get to do better. But that kind of was an inspiration to me that I started, not only did I do 5Ks and I had a lot of fun with that, but then those became the next thing. So I started doing some marathons and that built up. Actually, I ended up hurting a hip while running. And so my doctors, when we had those rough conversations, I had hip surgery and I said, "How am I going to be running again?" They said, "You probably shouldn't be running very much." I was like, "Okay, but I'm no longer a 225-pound person unless I'm exercising. This is going to be an issue." And they said, "Start swimming and riding a bike." And so I started swimming, I started riding a bike, and all of a sudden I'm pulling together components of doing a triathlon and did those, and they started building. And then, yes, it did. To be an Ironman triathlete, it takes a lot of crazy because it is a long day. But there is the aspect of, and I think it's part of my passion. And it got me through cancer was I had a view of if you believe in the impossible, the incredible can come true. And that quote actually comes from Field of Dreams that we saw in, I think it was in the 80s. But if you have amazingly big, crazy, awesome goals and you find a way to get them done, it is beyond a powerful experience. And when we close our eyes the last time and we're looking back and we've got those flashes of our memories, seeing my kid grow up and then also crossing some of those finish lines are going to be those memories that stick with me.
I agree. Remind people what a triathlon is. I believe,
Oh,
if I'm not mistaken, it involves riding a bike for 100 miles, swimming for a mile and a half, and then running a marathon.
it's a little more than that.
Oh my
Yes. Yes. It is swimming 2.4 miles, which is officially 4 kilometers, I believe. Then it is a 112-mile bike ride and then a full marathon. It is for elite athletes, it is an 8.5 hour day. For a non-elite athlete like me, it is a somewhere between 14 and 17-hour day. Um,
And for a non-athlete like me, it'd take 4 weeks.
if and when you are doing a race, Greg, here in Arizona in November, Ironman Arizona is down here. I'll be glad to put that medal on you 4 weeks later. But yeah, when you cross an Ironman finish line, one of the things they do, it is a beautiful tagline. When you cross, they say your name and they say, "You are an Iron." And as you cross the finish line, they yell out, "Paul Weigel, you are an Ironman." And it is an amazing amount of validation. And actually, when I finished my very first one, because I've done a few, my very first one, they yell out, "Paul Weigel." And I'm just like, as I'm crossing the finish line, I'm thinking to myself, I've done all of this work and you've mispronounced my name. So that was a big drive for me to do my second one so I could hear them pronounce my name correctly.
That's funny.
It was disheartening at the time, but then we all find it comes back to I love the aspect of the things you are doing within your podcast and the group of finding a passion and a purpose. And deep down, when it comes down to it, whether it's me in my 40s or now in my mid 50s, that if you find that little ember, if you find that ember that is helping you exercise, that is helping you write a book, that is helping you do a podcast, that is helping you live your best life as a grandfather, that it may start as just this teeny little spark, but if it can just start growing and growing and become this tremendous wildfire, then what a great world and great life you're living.
Are you a man of faith? And if so, did the cancer diagnosis and treatment have any impact on that?
Great question. I am spiritual. I was raised not religiously at all. And honestly, that was, as I was going through treatment, a hard part of trying to reconcile. How do I reconcile being so sick without having guidance and something? Through Livestrong, I got introduced to a group called the Immerman Angels, and they line you up with a fellow cancer patient who's probably had a similar experience, able to talk through. And Fran, who is now a wonderful friend of mine, Fran Curry, he is a reborn, and he and I would have very in-depth conversations, usually like at 2 a.m, about how do I make sense of all this and how do we get things aligned? And so for me, I'm very comfortable with my relationship with God or time or fate or whatever that may be. For me, my relationship continues to change. And as I think many of us, as we get older, we find that spirituality a little bit more. And I hope we find that groundedness a little bit more. So your question was, am I a man of faith? And I would say, yes, I am.
What prompted you to write a book about your experience?
So what prompted a book? So while I was sick, I mentioned that my numbers were not great as I was going through treatment. But what I mean by numbers is the size of my tumor, the lymph nodes, some of the other markers were concerning. And I did not have a lot of support at home. We were struggling some there. And I wanted to have a way that I could share with people some of my experience, not my story, because this is 11 years ago. And so I actually had written a blog that talked about what I was going through at different times. I talked about the steps, all going down to the University of Washington and always insisting on taking 6 flights of stairs down to the radiation room and the 6 flights up because I didn't want to be a cancer patient. And I talked about what it meant, the experience of having chemo. And I talked about falling asleep next to my daughter because we just both needed a safe place. And I looked at that 10 years later, and it was inspiring and it was a neat thing. And then as Natalie has gotten older, she is now 13, 14 and trying to understand what happened. And so I took my blog and I started with it. And then I started working with a friend of mine, Mary, and Mary actually, she has now passed. She had her own battle with kidney cancer. And when I started working on the book last year, which really all I wanted to do was write this so that Natalie, my daughter, would have something to look at, whether it's now at 14. No, she's not going to read it when she's 14. But I hope she'll read it when she's 25 and 30 and 40 and 70, and just that gives her a perspective. But Mary and I started working on drafts of chapters, and Mary was at times critically ill. And so I would go through each week. We had a meeting on Fridays at 1 o'clock. And each week I would try and have updated my book or try and updated chapters or doing something, trying to make it a gift for her of something that was hopeful and distracting so she wasn't dealing with her own mortality. What it came down to was it was her gift to me. Um, and I'll be damned, Greg, the book ended up being pretty good. We didn't expect it to be, or I didn't expect it to be. I really just thought it would be a nice little. And then as I just barely started talking with people about whether the book would be something important besides just my family, the American Cancer Society said that colon cancer rates are going up at an alarming rate. And some of those things that we had talked about earlier. And it became so apparent that it was important to share the story so that people didn't have to go through what I had to go through.
I heard that more than 1 in 20 people are likely to come down with that type of cancer in their lifetime. Is that true?
That is true. Yes. And that number is changing, and we don't know the reason yet. And it is 1 in 20. The interesting thing is a generation 20 years before, that number was more like 1 in 30 or 1 in 40. It's likely environmental factors. It's likely what we're
Diet.
eating and diet. And the neighborhood I lived in, Colorado, had been an area where they had done a lot of mining. So was there radiation or different things that happened there? So they're still trying to figure it out. But what they expect is in the next 10 years, that number of 1 in 20 is going to shrink down to maybe even 1 in 15 or 1 in 17. So when you're in just a small group, that's incredible. And they've actually recently, I know this group that we're talking with today is 50 and older. They've recently changed the screening guidelines because people younger and younger are getting this. And so that they now recommend if you're 45 and older, that you get screened for colorectal cancer. And that does not mean, I know one of the things that people are still so afraid of is that colonoscopy and the screening for the colonoscopy and the prep beforehand. And nobody wants to talk, which is not great, but it's better than the option. But people don't want anything going on down there, and people don't want to talk about it. And especially with men, that they tend to be afraid of having that discussion. But so now with those numbers getting so much more challenging or so much more scary, we need to be doing something about it.
You had mentioned the mental aspects of going through all of this and how you were not getting a lot of support when you were going through the treatment and the diagnosis and all of that. How important is a good mental attitude to overcoming these kind of problems?
I think it goes back to where I said, if you believe in the impossible, the incredible can come true. And also being what I described about being a survivor, versus being a warrior and a fighter. I did my best every day to pretend that I was not a cancer patient as I was going through treatment. I actually worked every day except for when I couldn't post surgery. I immediately said, it's not just that I'm going to get through treatment. but that I was going to do a big race for my daughter. And that really helped me in my internal drive, in terms of my internal focus of where I could get to. So that you just have to. And I think that's part of as we get older, it is easy to become complacent. It is easy to, especially, I mean, some of the things of as we get older, we've had a purpose of we work for a long time and we've gotten a paycheck and we've got this value. And then all of a sudden one day we don't have a job and we get into what am I supposed to do? And we lose that mindset of where we've talked about a purpose. And I think it is whether it's fighting cancer or dealing with next generation of career or life, that you just have to have that strong mental attitude to really drive forward, because that's what's going to carry you forward. I've known several people who've just said, you know what, I'm done. And it's not that the cancer beat them or that something beat them. It's that they were just ready to go. So you have to have a strong mental attitude pretty much on everything.
I'd agree. What can people get out of your book?
They can get a few different things. First, my book is really a great love story. My book shows how much my daughter and fatherhood meant to me, and describes that was the part that really surprised me, that people continue to go back to and they say, yes, this really helps for cancer awareness and those things, but really it talks about the power of love and the power of perseverance, and you walk away feeling inspired about, and you walk away about being inspired about the relationship you can have with your children at different ages and how that love can carry you through. That's really what I hope people get out of my book. Certainly there are parts that are more tactical. Tactical is not quite the right word, but more specific, that talk about some of my treatment or talk about some of that experience. And I've been told that for those people who are going through cancer, that or trying to understand what a cancer patient is going through, that some of that is helpful. So I think it's a little bit of both. I think it's inspirational for in general. I think it's a wonderful love story, and then it provides information so people survive longer and live happier lives.
What's the story behind the title Iron Dad? I love that title.
Thank you. That is great. Iron Dad goes in so many different ways. Certainly, certainly we've talked about me being an Ironman triathlete, and that the aspect of saying, this is part of my identity and this is who I am. And realistically, I had used the Ironman triathlon as being a metaphor for my life, of that if I can get through that, I'm going to be able to get through anything. So there's the Ironman aspect of it. But my life has been devoted to my kid.
Does she live with you full time?
In half time now. Her mom and her mom and I live a mile apart. We actually,
Okay.
in terms of being an Iron Dad, after we got divorced, her mom met somebody who lives down in Arizona, and I moved down to Arizona from Seattle area so I could stay as close to my daughter as possible.
It's wonderful.
Thank you. So being an Iron Dad is being fully committed as a parent of dealing with everything else, the trials and tribulations of the world, but yet still being able to be committed to that, of all the, and being as strong as I possibly can for her, and having her understand that message is really how that all came together. So there's so many different levels to it, and it doesn't, nothing is stronger than the iron. I guess there are things more, but magnesium man or stainless steel man doesn't quite work as well. And it doesn't fit on the cover of the book.
That's fun. She might not appreciate it all right now, but she will eventually. When she gets into her 20s, she will understand the sacrifices that were made and that you did it for her, and it will pay dividends for generations to come, I'm sure.
I'm hoping so.
Then you started a podcast.
I have. This is along the lines of passion and purpose. So this has really blown up isn't quite right. But in January, as I started socializing, we talked about American Cancer Society. I ended up getting invited to an event with the the Colorectal Cancer Alliance, where there got to be some momentum on it, on the discussions. And they said, you just can't have the book standing on its own. What are those stories of hope and inspiration? And so we built, I say we generally, because I don't, it is weird for me to talk individually about my accomplishments because I do think that there are armies behind us and supportive of the things we do. And I have worked with many friends and partners, but I have developed a podcast called Gut Checks. And in the same way, and you can find Gut Checks, I think it's on, we've got YouTube and we've got any of the major streaming. But Gut Checks, in the same way Iron Dad can mean a lot of things, Gut Checks can mean a lot of different things too. Gut checks can mean those rough conversations you're having with the doctor and something's going on with my gut. But gut checks can also mean when you're really having to bear down and do something hard and incredible.
Exactly.
And so that's where, as we've just started to roll out the podcast, I've been interviewing people who are cancer survivors, triathlete. I just interviewed the CEO of Livestrong, and we're talking about how Livestrong can help make people's lives better. At USA Triathlon, I'm in the process of talking with Mike Ruzioni, who was the gold medal captain of the USA hockey team in 1980. And you think about, and you and I remember that. It is so funny for me now that I will say his name. And if you're 45 or younger, you say movie Miracle, and they're like, oh, yeah, I remember. But Mike and I met a few years ago, and he said to me, I said, you did this amazing thing. And he said, you know what? We were a bunch of kids and we just did something we didn't realize how big it was, but we just found a way to get it done. And that aspect of you find that inner determination and you carry through is the underlying message for it. So we're bringing in more people and talking about their gut checks and how life is continuing and they're becoming better every day.
How can people connect with you if they'd like to get in touch with you? Or to follow
They can in a lot of different ways. The easiest way is I've got a website, irondadbook.com. And there we've got information on my background, the story. It's got links to the podcast that we've recorded. As we mentioned before, you can find the podcast on any of the major streaming. And then my contact information is on the website too. So lots of different ways.
I appreciate your time today and for sharing your story. It's remarkable. It's inspirational, not only from the aspect of a parent, but also from overcoming an illness that a lot of people just are afraid of and don't know what to do. They ever encounter it. They think it's a death sentence, and you've proven it is not.
I hope that is a major lesson for everybody. And that is, even if you do think it is a death sentence, fight like hell. Do not just take what somebody says and assume that's the way it's going to be, because life can be a lot longer. You can live a much better life if you own it rather than you're a victim to it.
Thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it. As a dad of daughters only myself, I can really appreciate Paul Weigel's story about facing the uncertainty of leaving his young daughter without a father. I grew up without a father who was active in my life and impacted me in ways I did not understand. The experience taught Paul several important lessons. First, people must take ownership of their health care and have tough conversations with their doctors. When patients feel something isn't right in their bodies, they must demand their doctors investigate the problem. And if a doctor won't take the action you think he or she should take, then get a second opinion. The second lesson was to pay attention to diet. Although Paul loves pizza, he can't have it anymore, and even his daughter holds him accountable to that. But after having 14 inches of his colon removed, nor can Paul have foods high in fiber anymore, like salad and broccoli. The third lesson was not to allow a career to distract you from what's really important, your family. Paul had a great job leading internal communications for some mega corporations, but after he was diagnosed, Paul shifted into consulting jobs so he could be more active and present in his daughter's life. Finally, Paul learned the true value of being active. 6 months after completing chemotherapy, he participated in an Ironman triathlon, which involves swimming for 2.4 miles, then biking 112 miles, before running a full 26.2-mile marathon. Paul wanted to share his life-changing story with others, so he wrote a book titled Iron Dad, a cancer survivor's story of discovering strength, life, and love through fatherhood. Although the book talks about his struggle to overcome cancer, Paul said it's more of a love story about a father's commitment to his daughter and the incredible bond they share. His book is available on Amazon and in other bookstores. Paul also started a podcast this year called Gut Checks, where he interviews people who have found a way to dig deep and do something amazing. He also started doing public speaking. People can connect with Paul by visiting irondadbook.com or looking for him on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. That's all I have for this week's show. If you'd like help in identifying a purpose for your life or to get help planning your next steps, I'm offering a complimentary brainstorming session to members of the Forward from 50 Facebook community. For details, connect with me on Facebook or visit www.forwardfrom50.com. I'll have another inspirational interview on the next episode of the Forward from 50 podcast. Thanks for listening, and if you like this show, please consider leaving a review wherever you download the episodes.